No doubt you've heard that the age of the last man is the longest and that there should be the transvaluation of values. But if you're taking Nietzsche's, say, prophecy, as it were, that relates to the plight of Western man, what would actually have to occur in order to see this transvaluation of value? I want to explore this practically by looking at our existential status when we're given as the principal product of civilization, which would be the consumer, or we could say Nietzsche's last man. So if we're produced to be credit instruments, to be passive, to accept a fate, perhaps even a fate worse than death, then we can look at this but through the prism of what we value. And so in turn, see the potential for action, so the creativity that he always talks about, but in reference to what would be a way of life beyond the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. So if you haven't asked yourself how you produce yourself as Nietzsche's last man or that principal product, then ultimately this is really a prerequisite when you're looking at the way how that you would value. There will be the transvaluation of value, and ultimately you can look at one primary value that you really need to look at. So what you actually value, and actually question its legitimacy. And this is ultimately what we do. So if we are produced, then there must be a means of production. There must be a factor that we use in order to produce ourselves as that principal product. So there can only be one thing when you're looking at a form of life. So if the consumer is given as a form of life, but then we don't question that it actually is a form that life sits in, then what we do through our orientation towards life is dislocate the self, and we won't realize the way how our actions produce the very vehicle for our lives and then through that the way how we discount that. And so what we do is we create cognitive dissonance, or essentially what is a form of religiosity. We can say it's a form of religiosity because we're not questioning, once again, our existential status. And so if the means of our production is time, well, it's not time, it's ultimately the claim that's made on time. For time to become marginal or something that you value, you must invest yourself in it. But the self that you invest in time is ultimately the marginal self, because it predicates your actions as to seek a return for your absencing of the creative self. Nobody looks at it this way, because ultimately you're sold on life not to see that. So this is the context. This is the horizon that we find ourselves, say, at, in order to, say, orientate towards a dawn. So you have to realize that maybe you're in a labyrinth and you don't know the nature of the labyrinth, because you don't know literally that spiritual disease that maybe Nietzsche tried to actually track when he looked at the pathological kind of state of herd morality, as it were. So we could say that the end product for that is that moral worldview is the principal product that you're given as. So then a consumer does not become, a consumer is not just a consumer, it's a religious artifact, we could say. And we can connect to the religious artifact that we produce in reference to the spirituality that drives our actions. And so if our actions are a compensatory exercise, then we cannot be indivisibly given to life, and so therefore transcend what is handed down to us is our form of transcendence, which would be social mobility, or the way how you invest in the value of your time through the way that you're orientated towards disinhibiting the agency that you're credited when you're given as Nietzsche's last man. And so if we frame it along these lines, then this is inextricably connected to the transvaluation relates to the way how time's given to us. And so the way how that we would have to create beyond our captivation, not to see that that's actually just immanentizes a transcendental value judgment or an accusation against life, which you can connect to the genealogy of morals, which Nietzsche always talks about, in turn makes the provocation, maybe we could say, of his philosophy in reference to that. So that means there's one value that you have to transcend. So that's the way how time is given to you as marginal, and the way how that captivates your vision, not to see the way how you could cooperate with other people or other last men given in the same way. And if that is the case, then ultimately you can understand the way how that the entrepreneur is given for risk taking for men, let's say in particular, Western men in particular. But that ensures the way how you look at what your legacy of your actions in reference to what. Because let's say if you to go down that angle, your legacy is literally a buyer's journey, all right? Because it's the same thing. You've got to look at what is foundational, and so that means to say that you would have to cooperate on a venture. So risk your time beyond the economic good it's otherwise given as. You can only do that as a people, and so if you are a risk taker, and your risk would be orientated towards a venture that you set out. You're venturing out. Your pathfinding is for a buyer's journey that's already been set for your aspirations. So if you don't question the nature of the way how time, modernity, is literally immanentized as a transcendental claim or the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey for your aspirations, and you think that's legitimate for your life, then you're not looking at your life holistically. You're still investing in the marginal self, and ultimately the way how you discount what would be the creative self. And so therefore the way how that you would create beyond your own captivation, not to see what you outsource. So that means to say that your actions have to be predicated not by a return, but by a perennial genesis. And a perennial genesis as such is you animate what is without origination. So you constantly keep in movement what would be life. So to not seek a return for your actions, but the perennial wellspring of them. And so that means to say that you are building a legacy beyond your own life, so ultimately what you would hand down to your descendants. You can only hand down a way of life to your descendants if all you as last men acknowledge the significance of your actions, the way how that you could create together. If you don't know that, then you get sold a buyer's journey. That's all you're doing. That's all you're going to be bequeathing to your descendants is a buyer's journey. All right. So once again, the transvaluation of values relates to the transvaluation of time given as an economic good or given as the means of your production to produce you as the last man. To become the overman in that context is in reference to the spirituality of compensation, or essentially the accusation that's been made against your life, or the original sin to be born in the first place. All right. So you can relate that to Christian ethics, theology, or the redemptive history beyond Christianity, but look at redemptive history. And so therefore, what would be your redemption there? Well, it wouldn't be seeking a return for your actions. It would be your actions become lost on yourself, in the sense that what you animate is a creativity without end that animates the spirit. So you can only animate the spirit, your spirit as an individual, by looking at the way how you create an ethos with other people their existential status is given in the same way. Because that means to say that your pathfinding would be finding a way out of a labyrinth, and the labyrinth is a line, is not worthy of the Minotaur, what we're dealing with. It's not initiation rite from the ancients and the way how that they created labyrinths in reference to death. You're in a labyrinth and it's a line. And so if you know, it kind of acknowledge the way how that when time's given as an economic good or as a value, you get sold not to see that your orientation is literally a line. And so therefore, if you acknowledge that, then it's the way how you cooperate. It's the turns of creativity that are animating something ultimately without end. That's the perennial wellspring of a spirit that you share. And so that means to say that you do not outsource creation. So if the God of the Bible is independent from its creation, then this is the way that you become a co-creator and you animate a spirit without end. That spirit is not the spirit basically of redemptive history. It's complete. It's ancient. It's as old as time itself. It's before time. It's the earth. It's a perennial. It's doing justice to say to life. All right. So not a life that's qualified through legitimizing the use of a credit you did not originate, and so allowing your actions to be animated by a false transcendence, and then introduced a leveraging principle into your life, and so therefore sell you the aspiration as to what would constitute life through social mobility or your transcendence, through the kudos of status that's going to be held in the eyes of your peers. You know, that is complete. That's a completely aberrant spirituality. And so therefore when you're looking at the transvaluation of value, once again it comes down to that touchstone. So if you don't acknowledge that the principal dogma that runs your life is that, you know, time is of value, and that is a dogma that is handed down unquestionably, and you become the adherent of a bad faith, then that's literally the prerequisite for any transvaluation of value. Because if you understand the way how you become an actuary self, so the way you sell yourself on work-life balance, and so the way how that you separate the self, and so the publicness that you share, what's your publicness that you share with people? Well, it's as economic agents, and that's predicated upon the way how time is given as a means of your production for you to produce yourself as the very economic agent, the very thing that can be replaced. So the only way that you cannot be replaced is through animating, obviously, a creativity that you're otherwise not credited when you're given as a demand center. And so that means to say that your publicness would change. The sense of publicness would change. But in order for it to change, you have to acknowledge where you are. So if you're in a kind of death realm, as it were, because you've spiritualized time and you cannot be orientated towards life outside that claim, it kind of immanentizes an atemporal realm, as it were. And so in order to be orientated, that is to acknowledge where you are, and then what you're doing is that you're sharing a conversation that the no ones will own in order to orientate the significance of actions when you decide to act. If you don't give it the practical application, so if you don't look at, say, Nietzsche's philosophy as a provocation for you to create beyond the self, to create beyond the self is beyond the marginal self, or the self that you invest in through the consumer that is produced as a vehicle for your life. And so what you do is that you look at what you do here, that's the value of what you do here, but the consumer is always given with what you do, because you place yourself in it, because life's given as a buyer's journey. And so therefore, if you cannot look at the question of credit, all right, beyond a means of exchange to what would transcend that, then ultimately you're going to be legitimizing your actions as money making, and so introduce a usurping principle to your very life, and yet you'll sell yourself otherwise. And so we can say that this is what I always talk about. This is literally, you have to entertain the thought crime, and the thought crime is time of value, or can you live life beyond the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey? All right, because if through you have to atone for your life because you've been born by seeking credit to legitimize your actions, so the way how you would animate your life, then ultimately it's a form of expiation. Will you animate the creativity that you're otherwise not credited, and so therefore be orientated towards life as an initiation? Literally, and the initiation is done through turns, or literally as last men, and the way how that you become what Nietzsche would say would be the Übermensch in that way. And so therefore you create beyond the self, beyond your own redundancy, and that's what you hand down, is a life that does not make redundant the human being or the person, and because all the claims that's made over the person in order to animate what would be the life, you are removing that. But you can only do that through the way how that you transcend what you're otherwise sold on, to understand where you are when you're beholden to something that ultimately you can't see, or the nature of what is the spiritual disease. So you have to diagnose that first to establish that, and then then maybe find that kind of North Star, or the pathfinding. And the pathfinding happens through steps that each one, all of us individually would take. But if you've got that commonality, you become like brothers in arms, as it were, because you know what you're doing. Each of you know what you're doing. And so what would be the entrepreneurial spirit that is risk taking is broadened out because it's an existential risk. Because the risk that you otherwise externalize through only being an economic agent, that risk is totalized, but you can't connect it to your marginal actions. And so obviously to take a step beyond the map terrain of a buyer's journey is to venture in no man's land. That's where you meet your brothers in arms. Cheers.